Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. I'm pleased to welcome you back to our voter education webinar series. We're holding a webinar every week leading up to the election. And actually, next week we'll have two events, so make sure to check out the full schedule and register at securefreedom.org. Today's program is entitled, Why China is the Most Important National Security Issue in the 2020 Election, featuring our guests Jeff Nyquist and Sam Faddis, and moderated by my CSP colleague Frank Gaffney. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar control panel. And I will read those questions at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website, securefreedom.org. And with that, I'll hand it over to the Center's Executive Chairman, as well as the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, Frank Gaffney.
Adam, thank you so much, as always, for your help in making these miracles happen. It's great to be with all of you on what I think really is topic A for this election season. It is, of course, one of myriad issues that are in play, but it really requires the most urgent attention because what will be on the plate, no matter who the next commander-in-chief may be, front and center in the sort of national security arena, obviously, in the economic arena, assuredly, it appears now as well in the public health space, will be the threat posed to the United States by the Chinese Communist Party. We will use its acronym, I'm sure, a lot of the time, CCP. This is the entity that, of course, runs the government of China and dominates mercilessly, as it happens, the people of China. And we know from its own doctrine and the speeches of its leadership, notably Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, that its ambition is to dominate the world. And that would mean supplanting the United States by force, if necessary. To talk about why this is the national security challenge of the moment, and therefore why it should be front and center in election 2020, I'm delighted to have two of my most esteemed colleagues. J.R. Nyquist, better known to his friends, and I'm one of them, as Jeff, is a trained political scientist, a very accomplished columnist, the author of several important books, including The Origins of the Fourth World War, and the brand new book, The Fool and His Enemy. He will be talking with Sam Faddis and me. Sam is also known formally as Charles Faddis. He's had a very distinguished career of public service over the years. He served as an Assistant Attorney General for Washington State. He served in the uniform of the United States Army. He served as a clandestine officer in the ranks of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine services. He has run for Congress. He has written both fiction and nonfiction, and among other wonderful contributions he's making to the public policy these days is as the proprietor and one of the most important contributors to andmagazine.com. It's great to have both of them with us, and needless to say, all of you. We're going to start with a question to both of you. Jeff, I think with you first, and that is, are we right in describing the Chinese Communist Party and the country that it is, well, misruling as the challenge of our time, and therefore as job A for the next commander-in-chief?
Yes, we are right, because the ruling party in China, the CCP, is a Marxist-Leninist party with Chinese characteristics. And as such, its doctrines, its beliefs, its revolutionary theory is to destroy capitalism/imperialism, that is the United States. And they're developing capabilities to do so. Their military doctrine and their strategies they're very secretive about. Meanwhile, their public pronouncements are most obviously spotted as lies. They're infiltrating our society. They're engaging in business activities which are furthering that infiltration. They're stealing technologies, and they're aligned with all of our enemies around the world, helping them.
That is a very succinct treatment of it, and we'll get into some of the particulars in a moment. But Sam, your take on that threshold question.
Right. Well, obviously, I would agree with everything that Jeff just said, but let me add this. We have made this situation infinitely worse and really brought ourselves to a crisis point. When we faced off against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, our policy at various points sort of ebbed and flowed, substantial differences between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. But throughout that entire period, there really was no question that we regarded the Soviet Union as the central threat to the United States of America. And we oriented all of our policy around that understanding. Well, we ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union. I would submit to you primarily or ultimately because there was never any question of the economy was stronger and that we were capable of exerting more force, running faster than the Russians ever could. The Chinese communists took note of that. They made policy changes to allow themselves, while not to politically change, to economically benefit from involvement with capitalism. They weren't going to be spent into the ground. And we have been complicit for a very long time now in cooperating with them and facilitating that. So what we now have is a hostile communist nation, every bit as much a threat as the Soviets ever were. But these guys are on the threshold, if we're not careful, of becoming the world's largest economy, and they're certainly number 2. So they have the capacity monetarily and economically to threaten us in a way that, quite frankly, the Soviets never did. And we are perilously close to having allowed that to go to the point where we're going to lose a war against these guys, and we need to radically change course right now.
Again, much grist for the mill here. We've got an opportunity to discuss each of these points, I think, in some detail. I neglected to mention one other feature of both of these gentlemen's bios. They are both, I'm proud to say, members of our Committee on the Present Danger, China. And just a word about that. This is an effort that was stood up reprising a similar effort back in the run-up to the 1980 election, in which a group of national security practitioners, academics, other subject matter experts, business leaders, some religious freedom advocates, and human rights champions came together to try to articulate in that crucial election how we should deal with that time's existential threat to freedom, as Sam Faddis noted, the Soviet Union. They wound up helping one of their members, Ronald Reagan, bring about the downfall of that evil empire, as he called it. And our ambition with the current effort, the Committee on the Present Danger, China, is to do the same, to free the world of the menace posed to it by the Chinese Communist Party. So we're going to be talking a bit about the various ways in which that threat manifests itself, and we're going to talk about what we can do with the help of people like you and I think the American voting population in the immediate future. Let me start with you, Jeff, on this question of the various threat vectors. There's clearly an ambition animating the Chinese Communist Party. What is the doctrine that they are pursuing for realizing it, as you see it?
Well, they're very secretive about it. And the interesting thing is we have, like, for example, in the 1990s, Unrestricted Warfare, written by 2 PLA colonels. Well, it's very interesting that the PLA publishing house that published their book in the 1990s is one that typically publishes fiction and poetry. The real doctrine of the Chinese, of the PLA, are in what's called codified campaign documents in which they spell out their doctrine. These you will not find extant in the West. Instead, we keep looking at their open source magazine articles and things like Unrestricted Warfare, and we have to look to secret sources and to analyze the clues as to what their doctrine is. Now, years ago, their doctrine was clearly defensive because they didn't have the capabilities. But in recent years, they've been updating their campaign doctrines in secret. And these doctrines talk about, we only know from like titles of what they are, expanding the theater of operations. It sounds like they are going to be moving out across the Pacific. And there's this thing, the secret speech of Chiao Chen, who was the defense minister from 1993 to 2003. This speech was published and translated by Epoch Times in 2005, and the speech is very disturbing. The speech talks about an inevitable future war with the United States and talks about directly attacking the United States and destroying it rather than invading Taiwan or India, but rather making the threats to those countries into a feint. And of course, if you look at the clues to what they're doing, their force structure, what little we do know about their doctrine is it seems consistent with this speech.
And this point about the Chiao Chen speech is that he talked about using biological warfare to depopulate the United States so that it could be colonized to create a second China under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Sam Faddis, one of the positions that you had during your time at the CIA was that of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism Unit's director. I know you have given a lot of thought to this in the abstract, of course, but also with regard to what the Chinese actually did just this year in terms of what I think can properly be described as a biological attack against this country. Whether it was engineered for that purpose or whether it was intentional is to be discussed. But talk a little bit about that and how this might fit into the doctrine that Jeff just described.
Right. Well, I mean, my personal opinion, having followed this very closely, and with my background, is that there is no question but that this COVID-19 virus originated in a Chinese lab. I think I feel completely comfortable saying that. Mm-hmm. To what extent it was engineered, to what extent it was deliberately released or inadvertently escaped, I mean, those are separate questions. But to the broader issue that you've brought up, what it demonstrates, regardless, whether it just simply jumped the fence and got away, is what could be done deliberately. In other words, if they didn't do it deliberately this time, certainly we now see what capacity they would have going forward. And nobody on earth has ever, that I know of, that follows this issue, has ever taken any Chinese assurances that they've walked away from offensive biological warfare, biological weapons seriously. Nobody believes that. In any event, there's almost no difference between a defensive program, which they admit to having, and an offensive program. Either way, you have to have the same organisms. You have to be considering the same issues. So what we see here, again, regardless of how this exactly transpired, is that they have this capacity, and one can see how rapidly it spread. Now, if you were to posit that we had something equally as communicable and more virulent that would cause a higher death toll, and you see how rapidly it has spread, now you're really into the realm of terrifying possibilities. Yes. Now we could literally be looking at millions dead already.
Mm-hmm. Sam, it seems to me that either way, whether it was intentional or not, whether it was designed for this purpose or not, and designed in a way that would be bad, but not as bad as what they could do, obviously, they've certainly learned lessons from what has happened to this country, as I'm afraid have all of the other bad guys on the planet who may have similar aspirations to the Chinese. And that brings me back to you, Jeff, a question that arose from what you said a moment ago. Biological attacks are not simply something that they apparently have put in place the capability to engage in, and perhaps done a dress rehearsal on at the minimum. But it is part of that doctrine that's in the book Unrestricted Warfare, as are a number of other things. And we'll be talking about several of them, I think. But are you dismissing the insights that that book does offer us into means of attacking the United States, destroying the United States is actually the subtitle of the book, short of actually using kinetic warfare, which they were not in a position to do back in 1999, of course.
Yeah, I think that you see the Chinese are very subtle in their deceptive techniques and their disinformation. The best disinformation is built around the truth, so that they give us certain truths, but they are salting it with a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding is that they only will apply these kind of methods, and that not that they will actually go to actual war, that they will take it to war. And it also leaves us with the impression, if we emphasize it too greatly now as the years go by, as they see, since that book came out, they have changed so many things in the People's Liberation Army, and that they have changed their doctrines more than once. And this change is accelerating, that we are left with this obsolete notions that may have been true at the time and may also mislead us, that they want to win without fighting. See, we have this emphasis. There's two things in Chinese military thought. There's the ancient Chinese tradition of Sun Tzu, which is excellence in warfare is winning without fighting. But there's the Marxist-Leninist ruling party that adheres to Clausewitz that says that's an error. It's all about the revolution, and that's bloody, and that's about battle. That's about confrontation. That's about fighting. And so,
and you have to actually use those techniques decisively to crush your adversary.
Right, exactly.
Isn't enough to get inside their hearts and minds.
Yeah, because the world bourgeoisie is not going to give up without a fight. So it's very important to realize that the Chinese leaders are not Chinese traditionalists. They're Marxist-Leninists. And so we've put too much emphasis on Sun Tzu and not enough on the Marxism-Leninism Clausewitz dimension. They seem to be preparing for a major war. We have to admit this.
Jeff, I guess the way I've always seen that book is that was then and this is now. It was buying time. It was sapping our strength. It was undermining our economy. It was putting in place influence operations, and to Sam's critical point, co-opting what I think of as Beijing's bankers and other capitalists to help them become more formidable economically, yes, but also oftentimes with dual use technologies. And Sam, on that point, I know you've been following closely and collaborating in the work of the Committee on the Present Dangers Capital Markets Initiative, which is aimed at doing what the Committee on the Present Danger did back in the Reagan era, namely recommend a strategy for curbing, if not cutting off, the cash flow of the Soviet Union, with a view to trying to do the same, despite how deeply engaged and how much the Chinese learned from the lessons of the Cold War. We've made some headway, I have to say. I think in part thanks to our efforts, the Trump administration has dramatically moved in the direction of discouraging, at a minimum, if not blocking, American investors from putting their money into Chinese companies, all of which work for the Chinese Communist Party, let's be honest, even if they're not actually People's Liberation Army companies. But Sam, we're seeing a determined effort being made by these masters of the universe, as they call themselves on Wall Street, and others in business to perpetuate this relationship, even though the kind of engagement that we were encouraged to undertake in the past is clearly inappropriate. now that this threat has become, well, it's metastasized and become so much more obvious?
Yeah, I mean, if I can use this word, this is maybe the most insidious aspect of this whole struggle, right? Is that we're in this confrontation with this, not with the Chinese people, obviously, but with the Chinese Communist Party and this ideology, which really is a life and death struggle. You used the word existential. Well, it is. It is a true existential struggle. And yet we have incredibly powerful people inside this country and frankly around the free world who have climbed so thoroughly in bed with the Chinese Communist Party and made so much money and continue to make so much money that, to be blunt, that supersedes any patriotic impulse or attachment to this nation state. That money trumps everything else. And so they are not simply going to look at this and then say, oh my God, I didn't realize the Chinese were out to destroy us. I'm going to change everything fundamentally. In fact, they are, as you've suggested, working night and day to fight any movement by this administration and going forward to substantially change our policy. They don't want any of this to change. They are making trillions of dollars off of what has happened over the last 20 years. And ultimately, they will sell out. We have seen this historically over the centuries, people who will sell out their nation, their empire, because in the short term, they're making a huge profit. They can be bought.
Yes.
And that's the sad reality. There are a lot of Americans that have been bought by Chinese money.
And just to go back to the previous era, there were a few who were willing to do that for the Soviet Union, but they simply didn't amount to much and were ultimately easily pushed aside when President Reagan pursued this policy of economic warfare, among others, for the purpose of liberating the people who were enslaved by the Soviet Union. Jeff, I want to ask you about one other piece of this that is often, I think, overlooked. In addition to what is going on here on Earth, and by that I mean, in every domain, the air, the seas, the land, under the seas. But there are also two other places where the Chinese are very aggressively operating and seemingly hope to become dominant, as well as here on planet Earth, namely in space and in so-called cyberspace. Talk about how they're coming with that project and what its implications might be for us.
Well, they destroyed one of their own satellites with a missile, showing that they have a true anti-satellite, satellite killing capability. They didn't really give too much warning, which created a kind of hazard in space for astronauts, because you blow up a satellite, you're creating a debris field that can damage their satellites and kill astronauts. So it was rather disturbing that they would do such a thing unilaterally on their own to demonstrate this capability. The ability, of course, to knock out satellites, given modern warfare's dependence on satellites for all kinds of things, including navigation and guidance systems, has tremendous implications, especially for a war in the Pacific, in which ships and submarines, which can be tracked from space, and attacks, which would be coordinated by satellites, could be decisive in a naval confrontation. So, and then in terms of cyber capabilities, China's use of the internet, China's, I think we've all read the stories about how they have stolen things right off of US government computers, plans, technology, things of military significance. They have been able to penetrate our networks and personnel data. And what's really disturbing is so much of our society now, as an advanced computer-directed society, relies on computer systems for water purification, sewage, electricity, all kinds of management and banking relying on computers. If these things can be attacked by computer, they can disrupt our financial system, They could disrupt our infrastructure. They can cause us no end to grief by these kinds of attacks. And especially now that COVID has made people into telecommuters, that the economy is more dependent now than ever on computer systems to function. If those systems should go down or be interfered with, it could have absolutely catastrophic economic results.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point, because it's in space as well as in cyberspace. These are means of attacking us economically as well as militarily, really strategic threats to this country. Sam, I mentioned at the outset, of course, that you have a lot of experience in the clandestine services, espionage, influence operations. How would you characterize what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in those parts of the battle space?
A massive and incredibly successful effort. You know, whoever's running their operations, I'm sure, has been receiving accolades and medals for many years. I mean, they're robbing us blind of our technology. We see increasingly evidence of connections between them and the people rioting in our streets. We see huge influence operations all over the United States that have been going on literally for decades. And, you know, I think people somehow, because it's not so visible, tend to dismiss espionage as always having some sort of marginal impact. And when I teach courses on this, I usually start by talking about the Manhattan Project, right? We ran this massive effort to develop an atomic weapon working with the British and others. For a very brief snippet in time, we were the only nuclear power on the planet. We possessed the atomic bomb, and no other nation on Earth had access to it, except any ally we gave it to. In an incredibly short period of time, the Soviet Union acquired that weapon. They did not do that by mounting their own Manhattan Project. They did that by stealing from us the results of all of that effort, and almost overnight became a peer competitor. And if you imagine the world without that change, if we had remained the sole nuclear power on Earth, how all of human history would have been different. They closed that gap purely based on spies, human sources inside the Manhattan Project. Well, the Chinese are in effect attempting to do precisely the same thing to us all across the board, all day, every day. Everything we count on to give us that critical, decisive advantage, stealth technology, everything else, just go steal it from the United States, and in record time, on a shoestring budget, we can turn around and duplicate what you have. And I think they are dwarfing the success that the Russians ever had doing this. That alone is a critical threat to our national security.
It really is. It completely undercuts the qualitative edge that we've long prided ourselves in and relied upon in dealing with often superior numbers of planes, ships, missiles, tanks, and the like. Jeff, one further question, and I want to come to what do we do about all this. Sam kind of alluded to it earlier, but one of the other things that's going on in our country, of course, at the moment is another technique that was identified in unrestricted warfare, namely street riots, upheavals that would both distract and perhaps achieve the ultimate goal of the Chinese Communist Party, which is, of course, the overthrow of our government and the collapse of our constitutional republic. There is some evidence, and I think you've been tracking it closely, of Chinese Communist Party involvement in some of the mayhem that has been taking place on the streets of American cities. How would you characterize that involvement, and how important has it been to the success of Maoist revolutionaries who are very prominently in the mix?
Yeah, well, the two of the founders of Black Lives Matter have admitted that they are trained Marxists. And of course, as trained Marxists, the kind of Marxism they were trained in is the Marxism of the Chinese communists. That is, Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics. We clearly see with Antifa and Black Lives Matter the Marxist hand. And you refer to unrestricted warfare, but we can go back further to show how consistent the Chinese are in this. If we read Stalin's Foundations of Marxism, Leninism, or Foundations of Leninism, rather, all of this is described in his short book. He talks about internal revolution, where you rally the countries that have already fallen to the revolution in the former colonial countries into a giant coalition to attack imperialism from the outside, while you have an uprising, a revolution from within on the inside, and to try to coordinate those two things together at the same time. This Stalin describes in very simple terms the grand strategy of the communist project. And it looks like the CCP is following through on this idea. Stalin described Marxism-Leninism not as a belief system, not as a faith, but as basically revolutionary theory, how to take over the world, how to make a global revolution, and to eradicate capitalism, to eradicate the United States as the center of global capitalism. And that does appear to be the target, both of the internal uprising within the United States that we are seeing, and also China and its allies. So,
yeah. And Sam, I think you've done some drilling down on some of the specific groups that are associated with well, Antifa, quite obviously, but also with this Black Lives Matter organization. Can you shed any light on the CCP's direct contact with or support for those groups?
Right. Well, there is no question, as Jeff pointed out, that what we have here is most of the organizations that are in the street are clearly not just communists, not just Marxists, but have these Maoist tendencies, and we don't need to get lost in distinctions of different strains of communist ideology or thought, but there are some differences there. Beyond that, many of these groups go back for decades to having been pro-CCP, to having explicitly had Maoist thought, to being connected to that, and remain to this day to have very extensive contacts with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, and to clearly toe the Chinese Communist line. So, as an example, this Chinese Progressive Association, which has been very recently tied to Black Lives Matter financially, they are funneling money directly to a portion of the Black Lives Matter movement. There is no question, in my opinion, based on what I've seen, that organization is a Chinese front organization. It is a front for Chinese intelligence activity. It's part of what we would call worldwide the United Front, which is basically a massive influence operation run through front organizations worldwide. So that is not just an ideological connection. That's not just we kind of think the same thing. That is a direct connection to Beijing, from Beijing to things that are happening on the street. Now, how much money that is, I don't know yet. But that is a hard, concrete connection, and really shouldn't, frankly, be surprising to us, because consistent with what you guys have been talking about, this is the way the Chinese work, right? They work in multiple realms and in multiple dimensions and in multiple ways simultaneously. And for them, this conflict has been ongoing for a very long time. Just because we're not in a shooting war does not mean that they are not doing things hostile to us every day in any way that is possible.
Two follow-ups, Sam. One is, it's my understanding that this Chinese Progressive Association actually has been shown to be tied to the diplomatic facilities of China in the United States. I don't know if you mentioned that, but address that if you would. And secondly, is the objective, as you best can judge it, to be of both Antifa and Black Lives Matter and other Maoist front groups like Freedom Road Socialist Organization and its splinter Liberation Road, which clearly were critical to the emergence of Black Lives Matter, the organization in the first place, that their object is revolution, not simply, social justice or, ending racial discrimination by the police and the like.
Right. So there is, to take your questions in reverse order, there is absolutely no ambiguity about the objectives of these organizations we're talking about. Explicitly, directly, we are talking about revolution. We are talking about the complete abolition, is one of the words they use quite frequently, of the existing political, economic, and social order. So we are not talking about just reforming the cops. We're talking about communist revolution. They are explicit about being communists as well. Yes, you are correct. Chinese Progressive Association has actually 2 chapters. One of them in Boston has extensive contacts with the Chinese consulate, just as an example of the kind of thing they do. They sponsor annually a raising of the Chinese Communist flag, the People's Republic flag, in the town square in Boston. That's one of their big activities. Hard to be more symbolic.
That would be calling a tell, I think, don't you think?
I would say that's a tell. In the trade, in San Francisco, one of the things that association has jumped on as of a couple of years ago was all of a sudden it has become very important to them to counter FBI efforts against Chinese espionage. They have stood up an entire organization to brand the arrest of any ethnic Chinese as a spy as being racist and to try to counter this. That's, again, a little bit of a tell. It's hard to be more transparent than that as soon as we began to turn the screws on Chinese intelligence in this country, all of a sudden these guys decided to create an entire movement to counter this and brand it as racism.
Yeah. This is, of course, a classic piece of the Chinese Communist Party playbook and that of communists more generally. So we've given, I think, a very complete picture. There are always other things that we could add to it, but it's pretty comprehensive in terms of both the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party, the capabilities that they have been developing, the ways in which they have acquired those, often with our help, or certainly at our expense, and the purposes that these are being put to now, including in this most recent example. Just picking up on your last point, Sam, and then I'd like to get both of you to sort of lay out what we should be doing in the face of this kind of threat, in addition to, of course, making it very central to the decision that the American people are asked to make in this election season. What do we want to have as the mandate for the next commander-in-chief, whomever that may be, with respect to China? But Sam, just your question that came out of what you just said, where is the FBI with all of this going on inside America, the enemy within? Have they been essentially scared off or rendered ineffectual by these, uses of racism and deflection?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most succinct way to put it. I mean, as an old CIA guy, I'm probably obligated to say something snarky about the Bureau, but all kidding aside and professional rivalry aside, the Bureau knows what it's doing. It has a tremendous number of good folks. It destroyed the KKK. It destroyed the traditional Italian mafia in New York City. It can certainly handle a bunch of 25-year-old Antifa types from Willamette University in Oregon, or these self-described revolutionaries in Black Lives Matter, but it is not allowed to, as best I can tell from talking to Bureau personnel. And that has been the case for many years, that if you attempt to get the Department of Justice to come on board with investigating one of these organizations, no way. I mean, back in 2010, just very briefly, one of the big organizations involved here is Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They are a Maoist revolutionary communist organization that's gone through the usual name changes over the years. Back in 2010, the Bureau busted a whole bunch of those guys, served something like 50 search warrants, and was poised to tear the heart out of it. Not a single prosecution ever took place. Not one of those guys ever saw the inside of a courtroom. DOJ shut everything down. Very
Under
hard
the
to believe.
Obama administration.
During the Obama administration, and there's certainly very strong suggestions that part of the problem was that some of the folks at the upper levels in Freedom Road were way too close to people in the Obama administration. But regardless, there's no question, Department of Justice proceeded on not a single prosecution. Not just they didn't convict anybody, they never tried to convict anybody. They never prosecuted him. And I think that lesson is learned across a big organization, right? Okay, I'm not wasting years of my life and then probably having my career destroyed because I looked in the wrong place.
Yeah, it's much safer to be looking for those vaunted white supremacists rather than these revolutionaries, or for that matter, you know, the Sharia supremacists who also largely got a pass during the Obama years. Jeff, let me come to you. What would you recommend, in addition to obviously getting the FBI back in business, and not just on the revolutionary side, but also in really countering the theft of technology and understanding the magnitude of the threat it's posing to us, the Communist Party? What else should we be doing that we're not, and how urgently should we be doing it?
Well, we need to disengage from China. We cannot have these corrupting economic relationships, and we have to divorce our economic system from theirs. And we have to make sure that treason and the ideological subversion of our system is countered. We have to make officials responsible for looking the other way, as the example that we've just heard from Sam. We can't have the Justice Department not prosecuting communist criminals who are trying to subvert the system. We have to follow through. We have to stop the subversion of our system. We have to prevent our economy from being penetrated to the extent that, you know, in a free system, the people who have money, the big corporations, the billionaires, if they're in bed with our enemies, that just completely subverts even our political process.
Mm-hmm.
And we may be on the edge of losing our freedom and our country because of it.
Yes, indeed. Let me just say, before we turn to your questions, the Committee on the Present Danger of China has been working now assiduously with considerable help from Jeff and Sam and many of its other members on recommendations, specific recommendations about what the country needs to be doing now in the face of the present and, well, growing danger from the Chinese Communist Party. We have an enormous amount of resources, video, written materials, op-eds, radio shows, and the like, at presentdangerchina.org, which is the committee's website. I really commend it to you all, including in particular 5 papers that were written, very short, very readable, action-focused papers on various aspects of the threats that we've been describing, that we wanted to have be part of, among other things, the deliberations of the House Task Force on China, which I understand is just about to release its report. I'm hearing that the report may not have been quite as comprehensive as it should have been, particularly in the connection with this piece that both Jeff and Sam, I think, very helpfully talked about, which is our underwriting of the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, which is obviously insane. Let's open this up to your questions if we can at that point. And I want to say again to both Jeff and Sam, thank you for setting the stage so brilliantly. And let's see what you've got, Adam.
Well, speaking of CPDC, pardon me, I'm sorry. What type of pushback have you seen from Wall Street or others to the efforts of CPDC to expose the threat that China poses?
Maybe I could take a first whack at that. What we've seen so far is basically an effort to double down, to greatly increase the kinds of funds that are flowing to China and to implicate more and more and more Americans through their 401k plans, through their public pension funds, through their mutual funds, through their personal portfolios, what have you, in China. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's an IPO that is in the offing, an initial public offering for the Ant Technology Group. And our colleague Roger Robinson's group, the RWR Advisory Group, has done a fabulous risk portfolio that describes real problems with this company. Among other things, just as one example, it has been instrumental in the development of that social credit system that I was talking about earlier that has helped the Chinese oppress both the captive nations, the countries that it's already enslaved, Tibet, Southern Mongolia, East Turkestan, and Manchuria, but also now has available for export to countries like the Belt and Road Initiative countries that it intends to enslave in the future. This is expected when it comes to market in Hong Kong and Shanghai sometime next month, probably, to raise between 30 and 40 billion dollars, the largest IPO in history. A good slug of that is going to come out of the United States, thanks to Wall Street, its Beijing bankers, as I call them, doubling down. It's also raising money, if you can believe it. Some of these same companies, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, in this case, Bank of America, they're also raising money, if you can believe it, for companies that are actually identified by the Defense Department of this country as People's Liberation Army tied companies, what they call Communist Chinese military companies. They're operating in our country, and now they're raising multi-billion dollar-denominated bonds to help underwrite them. This is insane, and that's the kind of pushback that we've been seeing so far. I hope that the president is going to help counter that. I think it is absolutely imperative that he do so. Unless you guys don't want to have anything added into that, maybe we can take the next question. Go ahead, Adam.
So there's several questions revolving around what, if any, influence the CCP has regarding the BLM efforts in the United States.
Well, again, we have some terrific resources like those that are joining us today working that problem, and we're writing on it. We are helping get some videos put together on it. Our site, again, is a great resource for this. There's another site that I would also commend to you called choosefreedom.io, which has got a number of other resources that are also very relevant to this. But Sam, would you like to talk about magazine.com as another great resource for people interested in this topic?
Right. So at And Magazine, this exact issue that you just identified is something that we're focused on all day, every day. And there's a whole lot of pieces we have written over the last several months, and we've sort of got a hold of all of those threads, and we're pulling on them. I laid out earlier, I think, the status of our efforts, which there's no question that there are organizations that I would feel personally, professionally comfortable branding as front organizations for Beijing that are in direct contact with and assisting Black Lives Matter. Now, the scope of that effort, that's where we are. How much money is that, and how much difference has that made? On the FBI tangent that we touched on earlier, all of those questions should be answerable by the FBI, and the FBI should have been able to be all over this a long time ago. They have a lot of people. They have badges. They are operating legally and openly inside the United States, which is to say they own the turf. So them being able to determine this, put sources inside these networks and run this down, it's not rocket science. That's just basic intel work, and they should have done it. The fact that we have not done it, apparently, because we can't stop people from setting fire to our cities, is shocking, terrifying, and it's clearly, there's only one possible explanation for that. We are not politically allowing our people to undertake that effort. The 35,000 FBI agents, which is the current number, should be able to eat the lunch of any of these folks on our turf. As I say, they were able to do it to any number of previous threats. So that is a political matter. That is not a we can't manage to make it happen thing.
Right. And just to put a fine point on it, the fact that you've been able to get as much of this nailed down through open sources, perfectly legally, but just, booking the facts, it speaks volumes about what's not being done by our agencies like the FBI. Would you like to add anything, Jeff, to all of that?
Well, it goes to the subversion of the system. Look, back in the late 1970s, U.S. counterintelligence was crippled. We had in the 1950s, blacklisted by history, Senator Joseph McCarthy was the one who was blacklisted, not the communists. In the 1960s, the communists came flooding back into government. We made the anti-communist into a caricature of a paranoid, abnormal personality who was not to be given any kind of credence. And this has gone on for decades. And so our entire society, when we go to education, when we go to the universities, look, the communists control those institutions. The curriculum in our high schools are basically structured by people who got their ideas from the former Soviet Union. So the entire way that the youth are conditioned in our country is part of this giant system of flipping our system over. I mean, we talk about cultural Marxism, the facility with which the communists have been able to do all this, and our culture and our news media and now our government going along with it to the point to where, very funny, all these communist Chinese influences are what? The president is a Russian agent, right? Mm-hmm. This is the narrative we've been given. Folks. Yeah, right. I mean, right. Can we connect the dots here?
You've really written brilliantly on this subject. I remember particularly an essay about, us collectively taking a knee in the face of all of this, and what a terrible affront that is, given what is on the line here. We're standing up for freedom. We need to be standing up for freedom, let me put it that way, rather than taking a knee in submissiveness to these Marxists. What else have you got, Adam? Anything?
Will you comment on the link between Hunter Biden and how G and C, I'm sorry if I got that wrong, can manipulate Joe Biden if he wins the election?
Jeff, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, of course. This is a key thing. Look, we saw the Ukraine thing with Hunter Biden, and Biden's frank admission to basically, calling off a prosecutor, getting a prosecutor in Ukraine fired, and then the connections in China. The corruptness of an American politician, that is his willingness to take bribes, to do things for another country, is something that the communist Chinese really look to in people at the top leadership of the U.S. That means if Biden is amenable to this, and he and his son's connections in China, when he would go to China and bring his son along, and money would change hands. Look, this would be the prospective president's family, and this would be the most powerful man in the United States government if he were elected. And it's not only the bribery; it's a potential blackmail involved in being compromised by making such deals. I mean, he would be basically owned by them. He would be obligated to do what they want on a number of levels, and he would be bringing in people that they might be suggesting to him. And we could only guess at how much worse the penetration of our system at the highest levels and the disconnection of our intelligence community from their real missions by pressure from the top would then follow from it.
There's a terrific film that I hope everybody's looked at already, but if not, that you will before this election is over, and that is Riding the Dragon. Peter Schweitzer made this film, and it connects a lot of dots about what he calls the Biden's China secrets. Sam, I wanted to ask you a question on this point. We're told it's actually going to be the Harris-Biden administration. What do we know about Kamala Harris's ties to the Chinese Communist Party, or at least her attitude towards it?
Well, I mean, that's not something that I've drilled down on tremendously yet, but I mean, what we have is an entire raft of Democratic politicians coming out of the same milieu. who are in bed with the Chinese communists to a huge extent. I mean, most famously,
especially in California,
Feinstein, but Pelosi as well. They have the same MO. They have the ladies inside the Senate and then the husbands outside who actually cash in on all of these connections. The one thing I would add in regard to Hunter and, the $1.5 billion or whatever it is that he gets handed by the Chinese communists when he's traveling around with dad, we should not forget that one of the things Hunter did subsequently in combination with the Chinese Communist Party was investing in a specific company involved with nuclear technology. And we know as fact that that company then was subsequently implicated in the theft of U.S. military secrets and specifically nuclear reactor technology. When I say we know that definitively, because in fact, one of their assets inside the United States was arrested, confessed, prosecuted, and convicted. So no question that they were involved in espionage. And this is a company in which Hunter Biden was directly involved, had put millions of dollars into that. And that's just one of several examples. So in addition to the whole compromising the vice president, which is not inconsequential, buying influence, which is transparently, in my opinion, what this is, we got a direct connection between the son of the vice president to Chinese espionage on our soil, which once again, somehow mysteriously has just simply been left alone. I mean, why? One would assume that there would be at a minimum a serious FBI investigation of Hunter's knowledge of that. One would have also expected that if this was really a surprise to Joe, that he would have reacted with some degree of alarm when one of the companies his son is connected to is found out to be spying inside the United States. But apparently there was no such reaction. That would actually be the first question I'd like to ask. What did you think when you found out your son was involved in Chinese espionage in the United States? Did that concern you? Apparently not.
Well, I guess we even have to establish what did he know and when did he know it, as well as what he thought about it when he figured it out, if he did. I think we're at the end of our time. I want to thank both Jeff Nyquist and Sam Faddis for extraordinarily compelling information here. And the thing that I value particularly about both of these gentlemen, and for that matter, those who work with us in other aspects of this work of the Committee on the Present Danger China, is the clarity with which they understand these problems, and they're able to communicate it to the rest of us. So Jeff through his columns and his books, and Sam through his books and his various writings, including terrific resource, really, at andmagazine.com. I just want to thank you for what you're doing to help raise the alarm, which is really the fundamental mission of the Committee on the Present Danger China, as well as giving us good, constructive recommendations as to what should be done about this present and growing danger from the Chinese Communist Party. That is also, of course, the mission we're about at the Committee on the Present Danger China. So with that, I'll throw it back to you. Adam Savitt, again, thank you very much, and to all of you for listening and for your great questions.
Just to announce our next events, next Monday, September 28th, entitled Restoring Law and Order, Law Enforcement Options for Responding to Today's Insurrectionists. And then Wednesday the 30th, Hackable Elections, Cyber Threats, and Foreign Interference Threats to U.S. Elections. So we hope to see you on those. You can register at securefreedom.org, and we'll see you next week.